August 9, 1945. Major Charles Sweeney circles his B-29 bomber over Japan. He's running out of fuel. His crew is exhausted. And in the bomb bay sits Fat Man, a 10,000-pound plutonium weapon that could erase a city in seconds. Sweeney's original target, Kokura, is hidden under clouds. He's already made 3 failed bombing runs. Fuel gauges are dropping. Japanese fighters are scrambling. He has one choice left: divert to the backup target, a city called Nagasaki, a place he'd never heard of until this morning. A city of 240,000 people who have no idea what's about to happen. And here's the part that haunts history. Just 72 hours earlier, another American bomber had already vaporized Hiroshima, killing 70,000 people in an instant. Japan knew what these bombs could do. They'd seen the footage. They'd read the reports. Their leaders had met in emergency sessions. And yet, they hadn't surrendered. So now Sweeney has his orders. Drop the second bomb. But why? Why didn't Japan surrender after Hiroshima? Why did America drop a second bomb when Japan was already on its knees, its cities in ruins, its military shattered? Was it a military necessity or the most controversial decision in modern warfare? The answer isn't what you think, because what most people don't know is that the second bomb wasn't really about Japan at all. It was a message, a warning shot, to someone else, someone watching from the other side of the world, someone who was about to change everything. By the end of this story, you'll understand why 2 cities had to burn, why 210,000 people had to die, and why the decision made in those 16 hours between Hiroshima and Nagasaki still shapes every nuclear threat we face today. This isn't just history. This is the moment humanity crossed a line we can never uncross. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Harry Truman didn't want to be president. He'd been vice president for exactly 82 days when Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. Truman later said he felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. Roosevelt had told him almost nothing about the war's most secret operations. Truman didn't even know the Manhattan Project existed. 2 weeks into his presidency, on April 25th, Secretary of War Henry Stimson walked into the Oval Office carrying a folder marked Top Secret. What he told Truman that day would change everything. Stimson explained that for 3 years, tens of thousands of scientists had been working in hidden facilities across America. They'd spent $2 billion, an astronomical sum at the time, and they'd built something the world had never seen. A weapon that could destroy an entire city in one blast. Truman could barely comprehend it. He'd been a farmer, a shopkeeper, a senator. Now he held the power to erase cities from existence. But to understand why Truman would eventually use that power, not once but twice, you have to understand the war he inherited. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had become a slaughterhouse. This wasn't like Europe, where soldiers could surrender and expect to be treated as prisoners. In the Pacific, both sides fought with a hatred so deep, so personal, that mercy had become a foreign concept. Let me give you an example that haunted American commanders. In April 1942, after American and Filipino forces surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula, Japanese troops forced tens of thousands of prisoners to march for days without food or water. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and outright murder. It was called the Bataan Death March, and when news reached America, it created a rage that would never fully die. Then came the island battles. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. On island after island, Japanese soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender. At Iwo Jima, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 200 survived to become prisoners. The rest died fighting or killed themselves. American casualties were catastrophic too. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking that 8-square-mile island. But the battle that truly terrified American planners was Okinawa. It lasted 3 months, from April to June 1945. Okinawa was Japanese home territory, not some distant Pacific rock. And the Japanese military showed what they were willing to do to defend the homeland. Kamikaze pilots crashed their planes into American ships in wave after wave. Over 1,900 kamikaze attacks sank dozens of ships and killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. On land, Japanese forces used every cave, every tunnel, every building as a fighting position. When they finally ran out of ammunition, they charged with bayonets and grenades. By the time Okinawa fell, over 12,000 Americans were dead and 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had perished. Here's what haunted American commanders. If this was how Japan defended one island, what would happen when they invaded the main Japanese islands? Military planners drew up Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan. The estimates were apocalyptic. General Douglas MacArthur predicted between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties. The Japanese military was preparing to mobilize every citizen. Old men, women, children. They were stockpiling bamboo spears because they'd run out of rifles. They were training schoolgirls to strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves under tanks. The plan was called Ketsugo, the decisive operation, and it terrified anyone who understood what it meant. So when Harry Truman learned about the atomic bomb in late April 1945, he faced an impossible choice. Use this terrible new weapon to end the war quickly, or order an invasion that would kill hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions of Japanese. But there was another factor, one that most Americans didn't know about at the time. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, had promised to declare war on Japan by mid-August, and Soviet forces were massing on the border of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Truman knew what that meant. If the Soviets invaded Japan and played a major role in defeating the Japanese Empire, Stalin would demand a seat at the table. He'd want territory, influence, control over Asia, just like he was doing in Europe. Truman couldn't allow that. America had spent 4 years fighting Japan across the Pacific. American soldiers had died on islands whose names most people had never heard of. Truman was not about to let Stalin waltz in at the last minute and claim victory. So when the atomic bomb was ready, Truman made his decision. The target would be Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 people, a major military hub, and crucially, a city that had been left untouched by previous bombing raids. The military wanted to see what the atomic bomb could do to a completely intact city. They wanted to measure its full destructive power. No variables, no previous damage, just raw, total devastation. On the night of August 5, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay sat on the runway at Tinian Island in the Pacific. Inside the bomb bay was Little Boy, a uranium bomb weighing 9,700 pounds. The pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had named the plane after his mother. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6th, the Enola Gay took off. The flight took 6 hours. The crew barely spoke. They knew what they were carrying. Some prayed. Others wrote letters to their families. At 8:15 a.m., they reached Hiroshima. The skies were clear. Perfect conditions. The bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, released Little Boy. The plane immediately banked hard and dove to gain distance. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. Then, at 1,900 feet above the city, it detonated. What happened next defied human comprehension. The temperature at ground zero reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. People within half a mile were vaporized instantly. Their bodies turned to ash before they even knew what was happening. The flash of light was so intense it burned shadows into concrete. You can still see them today in Hiroshima. The shadow of a person sitting on a step. The shadow of a ladder leaning against a wall. The people themselves were gone, erased from existence. But their shadows remained, burned into the city like photographs. The blast wave that followed flattened everything within a mile. Buildings collapsed. Trees were uprooted. Fires erupted as gas lines ruptured and wooden structures ignited. A massive firestorm developed, creating winds over 100 miles per hour. People who survived the initial blast found themselves trapped in a burning hellscape. Many jumped into rivers to escape the flames, only to drown or be boiled alive as the water heated up. 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 would die in the following weeks from radiation sickness, burns, and injuries. The radiation was invisible, odorless, tasteless. People who seemed fine at first began experiencing symptoms days later. Their hair fell out. They vomited uncontrollably. Their skin developed strange burns. They bled from their gums, their noses, their intestines. Doctors had no idea what they were dealing with. They could only watch as their patients slowly died. You would think Japan would surrender immediately. They didn't. In Tokyo, Japan's Supreme War Council met on August 7th, the day after Hiroshima burned. Reports were still coming in. The scale of destruction was hard to comprehend, but the military hardliners refused to accept it. General Korechika Anami, the war minister, stood before the council and made an argument that sounds insane to modern ears. He claimed the reports were exaggerated, American propaganda designed to break Japanese morale. He argued that even if the Americans did have such a weapon, they couldn't possibly have more than one. One bomb, Anami insisted, did not change the fundamental situation. Japan should continue fighting. The Americans would eventually tire of the carnage and negotiate a peace that would allow Japan to keep its honor. On the other side of the table sat Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. Togo had been pushing for peace for months. He begged the council to accept the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied demand for unconditional surrender issued weeks earlier. He argued that continuing the war would only bring more destruction, more death. But the military refused. The council was deadlocked. 3 members wanted to surrender. 3 wanted to fight on. Emperor Hirohito, by tradition, remained silent. He would not break the tie. Not yet. The meeting ended with no decision. Japan remained at war. Here's what most people don't understand about Japan's government in 1945. The emperor was revered as a living god, but he was supposed to stay above politics. He could approve decisions, but not make them. The real power lay with the Supreme War Council, the Big Six. And the Big Six were paralyzed. They couldn't agree. And Japanese political tradition had no mechanism for breaking a tie. So even as their cities burned, even as their people starved, Japan's leaders argued in circles, unable to make the decision that everyone knew was coming eventually. But Japan's leaders were also placing their hopes in one final card: the Soviet Union. Japan and the USSR had signed a neutrality pact in 1941. And even though the war had turned catastrophic for Japan, some leaders believed Moscow might help broker a negotiated peace with America. Better terms than unconditional surrender. A guarantee that the emperor could stay on his throne. No war crimes trials. No occupation. What Japan's leaders didn't know was that Joseph Stalin had already made his decision. He wasn't going to help Japan. He was going to destroy them. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had secretly promised to attack Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8th. That meant Stalin's deadline was August 8th. And Soviet forces were already massing on the border. Over 1.5 million troops. Thousands of tanks. Aircraft. Artillery. They were ready to crush Japan's forces in Manchuria and sweep down into Korea. Stalin wanted territory. He wanted influence in Asia. And he saw Japan's desperation as an opportunity. So when Japanese diplomats approached Moscow, begging for help negotiating peace, Soviet leaders smiled and nodded. But they gave no real answers. They were stalling, waiting for the clock to run out. While Tokyo remained paralyzed and Moscow prepared its invasion, Harry Truman waited in Washington. He'd issued a warning after Hiroshima: accept the Potsdam Declaration or face prompt and utter destruction. But Tokyo stayed silent. Days passed. No response. And here's the critical detail most people don't know. Truman didn't specifically order the second bomb to be dropped. On July 25th, before Hiroshima, military commanders had issued a standing order. Atomic bombs would be used on Japan as soon as they became available and weather permitted. No separate approval needed for each attack. The order had already been given. The crews had already been briefed. The targets had already been selected. Kokura was the primary target. Nagasaki was the backup. Once Hiroshima was hit, the military would move immediately to the next target. Unless Japan surrendered. Japan didn't surrender. So on August 9th, just 3 days after Hiroshima, the second bomb was ready. But that morning, before the American bomber even took off, something happened that would change everything. At 1 minute past midnight on August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Within hours, 1.5 million Soviet troops poured across the border into Manchuria. It was a massive, overwhelming assault. Soviet tanks rolled over defensive positions. Soviet aircraft bombed Japanese cities in Korea and Manchuria. The Japanese forces, already weakened and undersupplied, were crushed. Some historians believe this Soviet invasion was what truly forced Japan to surrender, not the atomic bombs. When the Soviets declared war, Japan's last hope evaporated. They were now facing annihilation from all sides. American bombs from the sky, Soviet invasion from the north, and an American invasion from the south that everyone knew was coming. But the American bombers were already in the air. At 3:47 a.m. on August 9th, just hours after the Soviet invasion began, Major Charles Sweeney climbed into his B-29 bomber, Boxcar. In the bomb bay sat Fat Man, a plutonium weapon even more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The mission should have been straightforward. Fly to Kokura, drop the bomb, return to base. But nothing went according to plan. Shortly after takeoff, Sweeney discovered a problem. A fuel pump had malfunctioned. One of his fuel tanks was unusable. That meant less fuel for the mission. They'd have to move fast. When they reached Kokura at 10:44 a.m., the city was obscured by clouds and smoke from a firebombing raid the night before. Sweeney made 3 bombing runs over Kokura, but his bombardier couldn't get a clear visual. The standing orders were strict. The bomb had to be dropped visually, not by radar. After the third failed run, with fuel running dangerously low and Japanese fighters reportedly scrambling to intercept, Sweeney made the call. Divert to Nagasaki. Nagasaki was a port city of 240,000 people on the western coast of Kyushu. It was home to shipyards, munitions factories, and the largest Christian community in Japan. The Urakami Cathedral, the biggest cathedral in East Asia, stood in the Urakami Valley. Thousands of Japanese Catholics lived there. They had survived centuries of persecution. Now they were about to be caught in an atomic blast. When Boxcar reached Nagasaki, the city was also covered by clouds. Sweeney was running out of fuel. He had enough for 1, maybe 2 bombing runs. Then he'd have to ditch in the ocean or try an emergency landing. His bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, stared through the bomb site, waiting for a break in the clouds. Seconds ticked by. Sweeney prepared to abort. Then, at the last possible moment, Behan saw it. A gap in the clouds. Part of the city visible below. It wasn't the planned aiming point, but it was good enough. He released Fat Man at 11:02 a.m. The bomb fell for 47 seconds and detonated 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley. The explosion was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, more powerful than Hiroshima. But because of the terrain, the surrounding hills contained some of the blast. The destruction was slightly less widespread, but still apocalyptic. Everything within half a mile was obliterated. The Urakami Cathedral, which had taken 30 years to build, was reduced to rubble in an instant. 40,000 people died immediately. Another 40,000 would die in the following months. Just like Hiroshima, survivors wandered through the ruins in shock. Many were so badly burned it was impossible to tell if they were men or women, adults or children. They begged for water. Doctors worked frantically to save lives, but they had no supplies, no electricity, no clean water. People lay in rows, dying slowly. Now Japan faced the unthinkable. 2 atomic bombs in 3 days. And a Soviet invasion that was crushing their forces in Manchuria. The Supreme War Council met again on the night of August 9th in an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. It was past midnight. The room was hot. The men were exhausted. And still, they could not agree. General Anami and the hardliners insisted Japan should keep fighting. They argued the Americans couldn't have many more bombs. They argued Japan could still inflict enough damage to force negotiations. The peace faction begged for surrender. They pointed to the 2 cities that no longer existed. They pointed to the Soviet tanks rolling through Manchuria. They said Japan had nothing left. The council remained deadlocked, 3-3. Finally, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki did something unprecedented. He asked Emperor Hirohito to break the tie. It was rare for the emperor to express his opinion in council meetings. But when asked, Hirohito spoke. His voice was quiet, but every man in that room listened. He said he could not bear to see his people suffer any longer. Continuing the war would only lead to the destruction of Japan. The time had come to endure the unendurable. Japan must surrender. The decision was made. But even then, it wasn't over. On August 14th, just days before Japan's surrender would be announced, a group of young military officers decided to stop it. They were led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, a fanatic who believed surrender was the ultimate betrayal. Hatanaka and his conspirators stormed the Imperial Palace at night. They killed the commander of the Imperial Guards. They searched frantically for the recording Emperor Hirohito had made announcing the surrender. They wanted to destroy it before it could be broadcast. For several hours, the coup seemed like it might succeed. They ransacked offices. They interrogated palace staff at gunpoint. But by dawn, senior officers had rallied loyal troops and crushed the rebellion. Hatanaka and several conspirators committed suicide rather than face capture. The recording survived. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the emperor's voice was broadcast to the Japanese people. Most had never heard him speak. His voice was high-pitched and formal. He spoke in classical Japanese that many couldn't fully understand. But the meaning was clear. Japan was surrendering. Across Japan, people listened in stunned silence. Some wept. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame. Others felt relief. The war was finally over. On September 2nd, Japanese officials came aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur watched. Hundreds of American aircraft flew overhead. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. But the question remained. Why had it taken 2 bombs? For 80 years, the official American narrative has been simple. The bombs saved lives. An invasion of Japan would have killed 1 million American soldiers and millions of Japanese civilians. The bombs ended the war quickly and prevented that slaughter. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many top U.S. military leaders opposed using the bomb. General Dwight Eisenhower said Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. Admiral William Leahy said the use of this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in the war. General Douglas MacArthur said Japan would have surrendered even without the bombs. So if top military leaders said it wasn't necessary, why did Truman do it? Here's the theory that changes everything. The second bomb wasn't for Japan. It was for Stalin. By August 9th, Soviet forces had invaded Manchuria. They were positioning to demand a share of post-war Japan, just like they'd done in Europe. Truman needed to end the war immediately before Stalin could stake his claim. The second bomb, dropped just 16 hours after the Soviet invasion began, was a message. We have more of these. We can use them whenever we want. We don't need your help. Stay out of Japan. The Cold War didn't begin in 1947. It began in the skies over Nagasaki in August 1945. Some historians argue Japan would have surrendered in August anyway, even without the bombs. The Soviet invasion had destroyed their last hope for negotiated peace. The naval blockade had cut off food and resources. The firebombing had devastated their cities. Surrender was inevitable. The bombs may have accelerated it by a few days or weeks, but they weren't the decisive factor. Others argue the Japanese military would have kept fighting no matter what. They point to the attempted coup as proof that even after 2 bombs and a Soviet invasion, some were willing to die rather than surrender. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But what we know for certain is this. The atomic bombs crossed a threshold humanity had never crossed before. For the first time, we had the power to destroy entire cities in seconds, to potentially end civilization itself. Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just targets. They were warnings. They were demonstrations of a new kind of warfare where there would be no front lines, no soldiers, no rules, just annihilation. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed. Today, 9 countries possess over 12,000 nuclear warheads. The United States and Russia each have thousands. Modern weapons are 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. There are enough nuclear weapons on Earth to destroy human civilization many times over. And it all started with 2 bombs, dropped 3 days apart, over cities that were never supposed to be targets. The Doomsday Clock, created in 1947 to measure how close humanity is to self-destruction, stood at 7 minutes to midnight when it was first created. Today, it's at 90 seconds to midnight. The closest it's ever been. Nuclear weapons are still here, ready to be used. And the decision to use them will rest in the hands of a small number of people, just like it did in 1945. So is it necessary? The answer depends on what you value. If you believe ending the war quickly was the most important goal, the bombs were justified. If you believe deliberately targeting civilians with weapons of mass destruction is always wrong, they were war crimes. The truth lives in that uncomfortable gray area where most of history exists. But here's what cannot be denied. The people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, The 210,000 men, women, and children who were vaporized or burned or slowly poisoned by radiation, they didn't choose to be part of history. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. And in an instant, they became casualties of decisions made thousands of miles away by people they would never meet. Their deaths weren't meaningless, but they were tragic. And the question we must ask ourselves is whether we've learned anything from their sacrifice. Because the world today is more heavily armed, more fragile, and more dangerous than it was in 1945. The risk hasn't gone away. If anything, it's increased. Hiroshima and Nagasaki should serve as permanent reminders of what we stand to lose. Never forget. Never again. Easy words to say, but living up to them requires something we're not sure humanity possesses. The wisdom to choose peace over power. The courage to step back from the brink. So I want to hear from you. Do you think the second bomb was justified? Or was it a war crime? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story matters to you, share it. Because the next generation needs to understand what happened in August 1945. They need to know what we're capable of, and what we must never do again.